Hey everyone, Andy again. This is part 3 of my AI video series. This is the one that's ostensibly not about AI, it's just about how people learn, but really important to understand more about humans so it provides the groundwork for understanding everything in the rest of the series, which is about our interactions with AI. So, without further ado, let's begin. All right, so yes, as stated, I'll be talking here about how people learn, not about AI. Um, Previously, we talked about how LLMs work in theory, what they can and can't do. The purpose of this video is to set the stage for understanding the impacts of LLMs on people. So it's it's important for that reason, and also as someone who actually got into the field I got into because I'm fundamentally interested in how people think and learn, I think it's kind of interesting, but that's just me. Anyways, just to recap what we've seen so far, I went over lots of evidence about how LLMs are designed, showing that they basically are designed to produce language or images or whatever that we find plausible, that we like, we interpret as friendly and hopeful. That's what they're reinforced to do, not necessarily produce things that are true, and not necessarily that are actually helpful, but just that are perceived that way. I talked about how they make errors. This is inevitable based on how they are constructed. This is not something that future generations are going to get down to zero. And moreover, the nature of the errors is that they're very hard to see unless you're an expert, unless you understand the details, because the errors tend to be overgeneral. And again, they're trained to make output that we think is good and helpful, so they tend to be really subtle and non-obvious. And so they're really dangerous, especially for people who don't have that expertise and have a lot to learn. So, how do people learn in the first place, though? All right. On some level, the very, very basic level, we're not actually that different from LLMs. So just as the nodes in a network learn by sort of, reinforcing each other, our brains, actually the neurons and synapses, they adjust the links between them in response to input in the world. So that's a neural network. And then brains, like I said, they were modeled after, neural networks were modeled after human brains. So on that level, there's a similarity. A lot of differences, though. In humans, what this means is the saying is neurons that fire together wire together. What it means is that if you want to learn something, you need to get your neurons doing the thing together a lot. All right. The more often that they're firing, the stronger their learning is. So what that really means is that we essentially are what we repeatedly do. If you really want to internalize something, you've got to practice it. Okay. And what that means also is that if you want to master something, then you need to basically have fluency on the lower level things that make it up. So if you sort of map things based on between the most basic to the most abstract, let's say you're learning language, right? Or learning to read. The very, very first thing you do when you're learning to read is you learn your letters. And then once you learn your letters, you can combine them into words, and then you combine those into sentences, and then you sort of read entire documents, right? So there's a basic to the abstract, and that's the level it goes. And, your fluency at a higher level, say your ability to form, words, is going to be much improved if you're really fluent on the elements of the lower level. If you don't have to slowly think, wait, was that a D or not? Then you can form words really, and recognize words much better. Until finally at the higher level, you can read documents and books really quickly if you have not a lot of practice, or if you have a lot of practice, not just with the letters and the words, but also the sentences. The more practice you have at the lower levels, the easier it is to master the higher levels. And one of the reasons for this is that our brains basically, we've got a distinction between short-term memory and long-term memory. Long-term memory is the things that you've internalized really well. Your short-term memory is what you're holding in your mind in conscious awareness at the moment, right? And short-term capacity is very, very limited. So the more you can offload onto long-term, the better you can learn and do things in the short term. All right. So, and the way to offload things in the long term is again through practice, habit, chunking, and that sort of. And the more you can do that, the more you have space in short-term memory at more complex or for more complex stuff. So, just to illustrate, so say I'm just learning, there's no way I can read an entire book or whatever. I'm using up all my short-term memory just to recognize what are the letters, what are the words, and so forth. And as you gain in expertise, you're not, your brain is internalized. That's an A, that's a D. It's automatic, right? At this point, if you're a fluent reader, you can't stop yourself from reading a word because it's so automatized in your brain. What that means is there's more available in your short-term memory for more complicated things like figuring out what does that sentence mean, right? And then once you're a very, very fluent reader, then, when I'm reading, I'm not thinking about consciously what does that sentence mean or whatever. I'm thinking about, well, there's this point of this book is not very interesting, or that logical point wasn't related. Like I'm thinking of a much more abstract level. Whereas, like I'm doing Duolingo in another language now, and I'm at the, this level here of like, wait, what was that word again? What's that accent for, etc. Okay. So learning is essentially the process of taking stuff from your short-term memory, which is really limited and effortful, and practicing to the point that it's chunked and held in your long-term memory, which frees up short-term memory space for more complicated stuff. And so a lot of expertise that looks like it's about the ability to do abstract stuff actually flows from having learned the really low-level stuff super, super well. So this is a study I did that sort of demonstrates this in a task that's kind of actually like a large language model task. It's learning statistical probabilities between symbols. So in the task, it's kind of a boring task. We just, people watch 8 minutes of this boring reel of just one symbol after another. And unknown to them, some of the symbols always follow each other. So this 9% and T, those always go together. So they're kind of word chunks. And others, the probabilities are lower. And so the question is, are people able to learn these probabilities? Blah, blah, blah. There's a lot of cognitive science reasons for particularly why that's as interesting, or how they're doing as interesting. The point here is, can people learn these things? And some people we gave familiar symbols, and others just totally new symbols, right? So they'd not seen these symbols before. But we weren't testing them on, there was no part of just the symbol learning itself. It was just, can you learn the relationships between them? This is a pretty hard task. But, people were above chance in both things, but they were a lot better if they, if they were given the familiar symbols. And really, the only way to interpret this is because they didn't have to use as much computational capacity, as much brain power to learn the relationships between the symbols. They had more brain power available to learn those relationships between the symbols because they didn't have to use as much to learn just to try to remember what the symbols were in the. Now you might say, okay, well, is this really familiarity? Maybe it's sort of that they could, verbalize it, or maybe it was just, maybe these new symbols were more complicated than, or something like that. So to really ensure that it's familiarity, we kept the stimuli the same and then just changed the participants. So for what I mean is, this time, instead of using familiar symbols, we gave everyone 2 tasks. They both had to learn the same task, either using the Chinese symbols or these what I call new symbols, right? Now, for Chinese speakers, the Chinese symbols are going to be familiar and the new ones are going to be new. For English speakers, everything's going to be new, right? So if it's familiarity, you'd expect that the Chinese speakers would do better on the Chinese symbols. But if it's complexity, then you might expect everyone will do badly on everything. And it turns out that was right. The Chinese speakers learn the things between the Chinese symbols. So the point of this is just one example, but I shared it because I think it's a pretty elegant example of this general phenomenon, which is that, to learn something that's more complicated, in this case, the statistical relationships between symbols, it's not just about your brain power or your smartness for that thing. A lot of times it's about what you have previously learned to become fluent in, and thus freeing up space in your short-term memory to handle the more complicated thing. But we really don't need intricate studies to know this. It's a phenomena that's everywhere in our world, right? As native speakers of at least one language, the more practice you get listening to that language, using that language, the better of a speaker you are, because you're not using your brain to think what word comes next, or I didn't hear that. You're using your brain to figure out what you want to say or do subtle things, right? But this is true, again, not just language, right? So expert chess players, they've cached in their memory a lot of like board positions and patterns and everything. So they're doing much higher level computations about chess than a novice is, not because they're smarter. I mean, they're probably very smart, but it's because they have put into long-term memory a whole bunch of stuff. So their short-term capacity is available to work on their expertise. Musicians as well, like all of these, many, almost every area of human endeavor, expertise and learning involves caching and automatizing and practicing things to the point that we're fluent in them. We're not having to think about them with our short-term memory. They're in our long-term memory and they can just be called up, right? So, even being really good with the sort of office administrative software, what's the difference between an expert and a non-expert in that? A lot of it is the expert just knows a lot of things in their short-term memory. Oh, that reflects that. That is that. And they can bounce around and do it all very fast. Medical expertise, driving is a huge example of this. My kid plays Fortnite a lot. Video game expertise. Most avenues of human expertise involve basically this: becoming fluent and practiced at something to the point that it goes in long-term memory, freeing up short-term memory capacity to do the complicated stuff. So this kind of fluency, there's no way around it because of the way our brains work, Hebbian learning and all of that. We just got to practice it, right? And ideally, you'd practice spread out over time. Otherwise, it won't go into long-term memory. If you do it just a little bit, then your brain interprets this as, oh, I really need this now. But it's the spaced practice that really is your brain signal that this is worth putting into long-term memory. I'm going to need this for a long time. And so let me put it in there, right? So you need to practice a lot, and you need to practice spaced out. Ideally, what you'll also do is practice on what's called the zone of proximal development. So you want to practice not the things that you're already really, really, really good at. Like, it would be very silly for me to be practicing my ABCs at this point. It would also be very silly to practice the things that are so far beyond you don't even understand. Like, if I'm trying to learn a language, I'm not going to be reading, Kant in that language, because nothing will go in. You want to be hitting right where you are, right? So if you've sort of getting, the very basics, if you're somewhere in those two lower levels, you want to practice right on the edge of what you're capable of. That is what really, really enhances your expertise, right? And if you're better, then you want to practice there. So you want to hit the practice at something that feels hard. It needs to feel hard, but doable, right? And that's part of the key, is it can feel unpleasant to be practicing here, right? It's nice to be able to practice to do something that you're good at, that you get 100% at. If you're really learning, though, you're kind of feeling at sea a lot of the time, because you're practicing at the point where you're challenging yourself, okay? And so that's a thing I want you to remember, because people don't like feeling unpleasant. We're also kind of lazy. I actually wouldn't put it that we're lazy. I think a better thing to say is that we discount future rewards. What that means is, if I'm trying to decide what to do, a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush, basically. I would rather all things being equal, value my current time rather than some future time, because who knows what the future will hold. Maybe, an asteroid will attack the Earth, or maybe there will be some emergency and that future thing is never going to happen. So I'm going to value my current thing more than the future thing. This is actually a pretty rational thing to do, at least in the abstract, right? Default to maximizing our short-term gain over our long-term gain, because our short-term gain is more certain, okay? So I think that often looks like laziness, because the short-term gain is usually like hang around and do something fun. But that's not always a good thing, because of course we live long lives, and if we always maximize short-term gain, then we basically screw our future selves over, right? So what we try to do is essentially forecast ahead and be like, I know I'm going to need this thing later on. It kind of sucks to want to do the thing, that I need to do to get it later on. I know I need money later on. I don't really want to go to work, but if I don't go to work, I won't have money. So we think ahead, and then we try to build in things in our lives that make us do the unpleasant thing now so that we'll have it more pleasant later, right? And in a learning context, that's what assessments and grades are for. No one likes assessments and grades. Teachers don't like them. Students don't like them. But they are necessary to make students do the sometimes unpleasant practice necessary to actually learn, right? That is why we have them all. If, occasionally you hear about, why do we need assessments and grades? As a teacher, I would love to not have to mark things or create assessments. It sets up a kind of, if you're not careful, it sets up a kind of antagonistic relationship between teachers and students. They suck in many ways, but I have never in my decades of teaching been able to discover a robust way to get students to actually do the hard practice they need to in order to learn without some kind of carrot, right? And I say this for myself too. As a student, you need some carrot to get yourself to do this, right? So that's why we have them. Okay, so then the purpose of assessments then is essentially to force us to learn things the right way, to get that practice, to get that fluency so it goes into long-term memory at the zone of proximal development, to do it when it's kind of unpleasant and hard. And assessment design is about getting learners to practice in this way and then show that they've learned it. So again, the main purpose of assessments is to force practice, but it's also to provide evidence to the teacher of what has been learned or not, so that in subsequent lessons that they can be tailored right? So exams, a good assessment will actually cover all of those levels. So on the most basic level, you should have some questions on your exam that are just about basic concepts and definitions and terms. You should ask something about the relationships between the concepts, but you should also have people extrapolate and implicate, and look at implications and stuff. And so this, essentially forces people to practice at all those levels. It lets which of those things people are doing well or not. And it also helps differentiate the students. The students have the basics versus the one who are really flying ahead. Similarly with problem sets, a good problem set or a project the first thing you have to do is figure out what's relevant for that. I always get a lot of questions from students of like, why didn't you just tell me? I didn't tell you because that's actually part of what you're trying to practice and learn, right? They also need to figure out what you've talked about in class, how it's relevant to that project, abstract and analyze it, and then put things together in a novel way. And then writing as well, it does that. The purpose of writing is not to create an essay on that topic, although it looks like it. The purpose of writing is to make the student practice putting their thoughts together and for the teacher to be able to see what the student can do, right? So again, at the basic level is figure out what's relevant to talk about in the first place, right? Describe it accurately. Combine that in a coherent way to make a claim and support that, and then consider counterexamples and edge cases and everything. And it's important that you do all of that if you want to learn those skills, right? Offloading those skills onto something else will just mean that you're not gaining fluency and practice in those things. And if you do that more with the lower stuff, then you're really not going to excel in the higher stuff. And I think many students have this misapprehension that if you can have, oh, just have ChatGPT or something, describe it accurately, then I can do the hard stuff. No, because you've not internalized that description. You can't, in your short-term memory, juggle those concepts because you don't have those concepts very well, right? And so the purpose of writing is to make you figure out what you want to say, figure out what you think, and start juggling and putting those concepts together. Fundamentally, writing is thinking. If you are having trouble writing, often it reflects that you're having trouble thinking. You don't have something to say. You don't know what to say. And so, that's the problem. It's not that you're a bad writer. It's that you haven't actually thought that much about the topic. Okay. What it means is that writing assessments force you to do those things. So you can probably guess where I'm going with that in terms of LLMs, but I think this is also part of a rant of, why learning is the way it is, and why assessments are the way they are. In a well-designed subject, you need to do all the bits of it because they all feed on each other and they all interact with each other. And the final thing I want to say is that when you're a teacher or a student or whatever, is that you really need to think about emotions. Our emotions matter a lot, and not in a, humans, we're dumb, why do we even have emotions? Although sometimes I feel that way. It's because our emotions provide really important information about our values and goals, right? And so it's people need to care about things, right? What this means is that people need to see why it matters that they're learning things. They need to feel that the hard work will pay off. And they need to have a sense of agency and ownership in the process. A lot of what I try to do as a teacher, before even actually sharing any content, is to build those things. And so part of what I'll be talking about next time with LLMs and their impact as learning is really exploring what we know about the literature on how LLMs interact, not just with what we learn cognitively, but also with our emotions, our sense of motivation and agency and so forth, because that matters too. So to summarize this bit though, I basically have shown that learning requires practice. We are what we repeatedly do. If we need to learn something well, we just need to do it. And there's really no substitute, because that is what our brains are doing on the brain level, on the cellular level. We need to reinforce our neurons over and over and over again. And if we want to be able to have high level mastery of things, we need to be very fluent and very practiced on lower levels. So that it's chunked in lower long-term memory, so that we have the short-term memory capacity available to handle complicated stuff. And what that means for assessments is that the purpose of assessments is to force us to do that practice. And it's the process of them that's the point, not the output. And you can't skip over bits of the process without skipping over the thing that you're meant to be building. That will set me up for the second part about how LLMs impact learning. Based on this, you can probably guess somewhat where it's going, but the details are kind of interesting. So I will see you there.